throat had been cut with a 4-inch laceration.
It was a very gruesome scene. I could tell right then and there that she was gone.
He could have escalated violence because he felt entitled. This man is more dangerous than she thought.
He was creepy, gave off some weird vibes.
If she disclosed her relationship with him, this man would have had a motive to kill her.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Just 2 miles north of Detroit, Royal Oak, Michigan is a thriving city of young professionals.
Royal Oak is a fun town. It has a great downtown area with lots of things for single life, shopping, eating.
It is known for its really vibrant downtown. It's a place where the whole region goes to celebrate and party, and it's a really fun place to live.
But in the evening of September 19th, 2011, the fun in Royal Oak turns to concern about one woman. 41-year-old hairdresser, Renee Chubik.
Renee failed to show up for her shift for work. It was not like Renee at all to not show up for her shift. She lived not far from there, and she wasn't answering the phone. That was a major red flag. A friend and I went with the landlord to Renee's apartment to make sure she's okay. And there was a blanket on the living room floor. When the landlord lifted the blanket, I did see Renee covered in blood. It was a very gruesome scene. There was no motion. I could tell right then and there that she was gone. So I was really just not sure. Renee brought a lot of fun. She was always the life of the party, happy, and just was a phenomenal friend.
Renee's landlord calls police.
Royal Oak Police called the Oakland County Sheriff's Office crime scene unit, who shortly arrived at Renee's apartment. Investigators found the victim lying on her back in the living room. A gray blanket is covering most of her body, but her hand is exposed on one side. And both of her arms are outstretched to the sides. The victim's hair and head are covered in blood, and a large pool of blood is found around her head on the carpet.
There didn't seem to appear to be a murder weapon, but there was obvious signs of a struggle, signs that something very violent had happened. There was substantial bruising to both eyes and cheeks.
Investigators see what appear to be 12 knife injuries in total.
Renee's throat had been cut with a 4-inch laceration across the neck.
Investigators recover ripped leggings and a black, high-heeled boot close to Renee's body, matching the one that she was still wearing.
At this point, investigators believe that Renee suffered a brutal death in her apartment by someone with a knife or sharp object.
The nature of the injuries suggests rage, anger, an overwhelming need to destroy the victim.
Investigators fan out to document the rest of Renee's home.
The apartment was in a state of disarray, messy. There was blood splattered on the walls. Investigators couldn't determine what was just kind of messiness and what was a struggle.
Crime scene investigators collect a swatch of fabric from the sofa, which appears to have semen on it. What appears to be a pubic hair is recovered from an area near the sofa.
Despite finding semen on the couch and a pubic hair, investigators at this point cannot determine if this crime is sexual in nature. There's no evidence of a break-in. It indicated to them that Renee knew the person that murdered her.
The investigation moves to the exterior of Renee's apartment.
Detectives search the area around Renee's building. At the front of the building on the east side, they find a charger which had been found in Renee's bathroom. The cell phone is sent to forensic investigators to see what information, if any, they can find on it. At the back of the building, in a dumpster, detectives find a plastic bag containing 4 rags, one of which appears to have blood on it. They also find an empty bottle of Barefoot Moscato wine.
The bottle matches those found in Renee's apartment.
2 cotton socks are found, which also appear to have blood on them. There are also 2 knives, one a butcher knife and the other a steak knife with the blade broken off the handle. Police believe the knives came from Renee's home and believe them to be possibly the murder weapons.
Based on the evidence inside and outside the home, investigators form a theory of what happened when Renee Chupik was murdered.
Renee could have let her killer in through the front door and past the kitchen and into the living room.
They talked and drank together. Then they got into an argument at some point.
There had been a struggle in the apartment.
But then it became violent. She's then violently stabbed. And then she was covered with a blanket.
The fact that Renee's body was covered with this gray blanket could suggest that whoever killed her was disgusted and ashamed by what that person had done to Renee.
Investigators surmise that the killer cleaned the apartment and put all these items in the trash to cover his tracks.
To find Renee Chupik's killer, investigators will need to retrace the last 24 hours of her life. Detectives start with one of Renee's friends, Rebecca. She has information about September 18th, the day before Renee's body was discovered.
Rebecca told police that she was likely the last person that had spoken to Renee. She spoke to Renee on September 18th at 11:44 p.m. Renee invited her over that night for a couple of drinks. Rebecca told Renee that she was tired and was going to bed. Renee ended the phone call.
Believe that visitor was likely Renee's killer. If so, that means she was murdered between 11:44 p.m. on September 18th when she ended the call from Rebecca, and 9:30 p.m. on September 19th when her landlord and friends discovered her dead. Detectives reach out to Renee's landlord, 39-year-old John Vietz, who had a key to Renee's apartment.
Investigators felt that having a key to her home meant he must have had access to her.
Renee lived by herself. She had said her landlord was always showing up, which was just kind of creepy.
Because there were no signs of forced entry in the apartment, anyone who had a key to the apartment, such as the landlord, has to be looked at as a suspect.
The landlord knows her comings and goings, her routine. He may have been somebody who felt they could take what they wanted.
A day after police in Royal Oak, Michigan, find 41-year-old hairstylist Renee Chupik murdered in her apartment. Detectives need to speak to the man who found her and called 911. Renee's landlord, John Vietz,
One of Renee's friends told police that the landlord was strange or creepy. He also had a key to the apartment, so the landlord has to be looked at as a suspect.
Detectives bring Vietz in for questioning.
When investigators speak to Renee's landlord, he's quiet and evasive. He tells police he doesn't know anything about Renee's murder. The landlord told police that Renee had no issues with people in the building and that she mostly kept to herself.
Renee had moved in 2 months earlier and had been a great tenant.
But he doesn't have more information for them.
Detectives ask the landlord for his whereabouts when Renee was killed.
He tells police that he was somewhere else when the murder happened. And we confirm his whereabouts at the time of her murder. Police don't find any other evidence which points toward him as the killer.
So detectives must eliminate Renee's landlord as a suspect and look elsewhere to find her killer. Police reach out again to Renee's friend, Rebecca. They want to learn more about Renee's background and if anyone may have wanted to harm her.
Rebecca told police that Renee had her so good at heart that she was unable to see the bad in people.
Rebecca brings up one of Renee's ex-boyfriends, who Renee thought was better than he really was. A 45-year-old bartender named Glenn Deakins.
Rebecca told police that Renee had gotten into a fight with this ex-boyfriend while she was moving into her apartment. This ex-boyfriend had threatened Renee with going to hell and possibly broke into her former apartment. He also had been trying to get in touch with Renee in the days leading up to her death. Renee described him as being nuts.
Glenn's a clear suspect. There's a history of violence in his relationship with Renee. It's fairly recent, and there's also a breakup, and so these are all things that could be risk factors for intimate partner homicide, which can occur not just when the couple's in a relationship, but following any sort of breakup.
Detectives track down Renee Chubik's ex-boyfriend, Glenn Deakins, and bring him in for questioning.
He tells police that he had not spoken to Renee in some weeks. He tells police that he last spoke to Renee on August 31st. They spoke for about 5 minutes, during which Renee told him that somebody was trying to kill her, but would not provide any details about who or why.
Investigators ask Glenn about fighting with Renee and about the accusations of aggressive behavior toward her on the day she was moving.
He told police that he'd said some harsh things to the victim, but he didn't mean them. And he said that on that particular day that Renee had assaulted him first, he warned her to stop.
Glenn says to investigators, hey, it wasn't just me, Renee was involved in this. I was trying to protect myself from Renee. Glenn's clearly trying to distance himself from any kind of past aggression with Renee, and the question is why? Is it because he's a guilty party?
Investigators grill Glenn Deakins about his alibi, the time of Renee's murder.
He tells police that he had started a new job 2 weeks earlier, and they can contact his boss, who will confirm that he was working when the murder happened.
Police call his employer and see if they can confirm his whereabouts on the day of the murder.
The employer was unable to account for the whereabouts of the ex-boyfriend when the murder happened.
Given his inability to confirm his whereabouts, Glenn Deakins is now the prime suspect in the murder of Renee Chubik. Maintains his innocence.
He tells police that he would continue to cooperate, would provide a DNA sample, and would be willing to take a polygraph examination.
While police await Glenn Deakins' test results, their suspicion alone is not enough to hold him. They have no choice but to release him with a warning not to leave town. With Glenn Deakins still the prime suspect, detectives check the last time he may have contacted Renee.
On examining Renee's cell phone, they find that it had either placed or received 11 calls between 9:56 p.m. on September 18th and 12:25 a.m. on September 19th. Police can now narrow the time of Renee's death between 12:25 a.m., when she last picked up her cell phone, and 9:30 p.m. on September 19th, when the 911 call was placed to Royal Oak Police. The phone records show an incoming phone call from Rebecca at 11:44 p.m. The remaining 11 calls, 9 incoming and 2 outgoing, came from or were made to the same unknown number.
But the caller's number has no name associated with it. Who did Renee speak to 11 times in the hours leading up to her death?
Police search several databases, but they're not able to identify the caller. They decide to keep calling the number until someone does pick up.
Finally, someone answers. But they hang up without ever speaking. And that number's owner remains a mystery to detectives. With that question still unanswered, detectives call in a second friend of Renee's to help them, Courtney Klimkowski.
I told them Renee was divorced. She had a son who was in his teenage years.
Courtney told police that Renee was still good friends with her ex-husband, and her teenage son lived full-time with his father.
Detectives asked Courtney if Renee's finances were strained as a single mom.
She wasn't financially stable, so she needed as many hours as she could at the salon.
Courtney said that Renee was also looking for a second job at the time of her murder.
But Courtney adds that whatever extra money Renee needed may have been for more than living expenses.
Renee was definitely into the nightlife, trying to see what life had for her. And I did have a little concern for her at that point. On the night of September 14th, we went out with a group of friends with Renee, and there was a man that she met at the bar. He was tall, gave off some weird vibes. After I had left the bar, I think she had continued talking to him.
Who is the strange man Renee befriended at a bar 5 days before her murder?
From her cell phone records, police were able to find a contact for the man that Courtney referred to.
His name is Daniel Landon, a 26-year-old security guard.
Renee had stated that the man that we met at the bar had been texting her. He was asking her when they could meet up, and she was just not interested in doing something like that.
Daniel was actually aggressively pursuing the victim, and she rebuffed his advances. This naturally is going to raise suspicions, and in this case, investigators know full well that unrequited romantic overtures or advances can be a strong motivation for violence.
This man, so angered by Renee's rejection of him, could have gone to her apartment and stabbed her to death.
Detectives have a new suspect in Renee Chupik's murder. 26-year-old Daniel Landon, who aggressively pursued Renee despite her rebuffs. Investigators bring in the jilted suitor for questioning.
He tells police that he met Renee on September 14th at a restaurant and that they hung out that night.
He says that during the time they were at the bar, he got her number, and since then they'd been calling and texting.
He said that it was pretty casual at that point. He tells police that he had not seen her since and denied being in any kind of a serious relationship with her. He also denied having had anything to do with Renee's murder.
And he also tells police that he'll submit to polygraph testing and DNA testing if needed.
Even before police take a DNA sample from him, They already have a strong hunch about the results.
We don't have any information which pointed to him as being responsible in Renee's murder. And so, police exclude this man as a suspect.
Looking for a new Aaron.
Aaron said that Renee was seeing a married man, and she had recently spoken of ending her relationship with him. Aaron provided officers with cell phone information for this man. With Renee's cell phone records, police confirmed this is the same married man.
The man is 47-year-old Walter Fisk. When detectives reach out, he says he'll help in any way he can.
Police ask him about his relationship with Renee. He tells them that although he is married, he's been involved in a relationship with her. He had met Renee Chupik a year earlier, and they had had sex within the 4 months leading up to the murder.
He tells police he was with Renee on September 18th, the day of the murder. Did he get mad that Renee wanted to end the relationship and that Renee possibly started talking to people about her personal life?
This man would have had a motive to kill Renee if she disclosed her relationship with him, endangering his marriage. He's got something to lose if the story comes out.
Renee is in a relationship with Walter, who's married. I mean, that's a potential love triangle, and we know that those can be unstable. If there's a personality who feels entitled, that rejection would be actually worsened. Maybe Renee wanted more from Walter, or maybe was threatening to divulge the affair.
Detectives dig deeper into Walter Fisk's whereabouts on September 18th.
He picked up Renee at 5 p.m., and while she got ready, he vacuumed and took out the garbage. They left the apartment at 6 p.m. and drove out to a restaurant in Royal Oak where they stayed for 45 minutes. They left. They got back to the apartment around 7 p.m. They shared some wine, cocaine, and marijuana. He said that he and Renee had sex.
He tells police he left Renee's apartment at approximately 8:15 p.m.
While he was driving home, he called Renee about 20 minutes after he had left her apartment. The conversation was brief because Renee said she was on another call and ended the call with him. He said that he arrived home at around 9 p.m.
When he got home, he called Renee again, but he only spoke to her briefly because she was on the phone with someone else.
But Walter Fisk has no alibi between 9 p.m. on September 18th.
Police began to wonder if he's telling the truth because he has a lot to hide in his personal life.
Walter may have been motivated to commit violence if this arrangement were to be made known to people who can make life difficult for him. If his existing relationship and the financial entanglements that came with that were to fall apart, what steps would he take to keep this affair secret?
After Royal Oak, Michigan police find single mother Renee Chupik murdered, detectives zero in on Walter Fisk, her adulterous lover, as their prime suspect.
He says that he last spoke to her on the night of her murder, which means he's a suspect too.
Did he really leave Renee's apartment at 8 p.m.? Or was he the one that really killed Renee?
Hoping to clear his name and keep his affair with Renee quiet, Walter Fisk consents to forensic testing.
He agrees to provide a DNA sample, and police photograph his hands and body. He also gives the police his phone so that they can examine it. although they cannot exclude this man as a suspect, police continue following other avenues of investigation as well.
Like Renee's ex-boyfriend Glenn Deakins before, detectives don't eliminate Walter Fisk entirely. But neither of those previous lovers have the cell number that matches the mysterious caller, who had talked to Renee 11 times just before she was killed. As detectives pore over their file again for anything they may have overlooked, one caller claims he has new information about Renee. He also says he's one more former boyfriend turned friend of Renee's, Alan Abrams.
Police ask if they can meet him in person for an interview, and he agrees.
Detectives ask Alan Abrams, when was the last time he saw Renee?
He last saw Renee 2 weeks before at her apartment.
Days before the murder. He tells police that he had tried to call Renee a number of times on Sunday, September 18th, but that he was never able to get her on the phone. He tried again on Monday, the next day, at around 10 a.m., but again, there was no answer.
He tells police he was so eager to reach her because they had a disagreement over a payment she was supposed to receive for working at a festival that he was running.
And then Abrams brings up something else from his past with Renee.
He tells police about 2 or 3 incidents that occurred while they were dating. She'd get very drunk, get a steak knife from the kitchen, and hold it down at her side. He thought that Renee would get the knife in order to get his attention.
Police wondered if this was actually the case. If he's really telling the truth about Renee, or that maybe this man is more dangerous and went to her apartment to kill her.
Suspicious that Alan Abrams may be covering his tracks, detectives consider whether he and Renee may have argued over the money he still owed her. And then it turned violent. If it's true, then detectives can prove it. Alan Abrams agrees to provide his DNA, his fingerprints, and his phone records for analysis.
Like the other ex-boyfriends, police could not exclude this man as a suspect.
But just like the others, Abrams' cell number does not match the one that called Renee nearly a dozen times in the hour before her murder. Not long after their interview with Abrams, one frightened resident promises to take the investigation in a whole new direction.
Police receive a call from a man who identifies himself as Kevin Kaminsky.
He wants to tell them about a man named Chris Hearn. Chris is a transient. Chris Hearn told Kevin that he had killed a woman named Renee in self-defense after she attacked him with a knife. Police now redirect their investigative efforts to Chris Hearn. Police were able to pull up records from Chris Hearn and looking into his prior history. Police find that Chris Hearn has had a number of encounters with law enforcement, including an assault case out of nearby Livingston County.
Chris Hearn is a man with a record. Could he also be the caller who harassed Renee just prior to her murder? To find out, detectives try that mysterious cell number one more time.
Eventually, someone answers the phone, and the man identifies it as belonging to Chris Hearn. But that man is not Chris Hearn. police call the number again, and this time leave a message on the phone asking Chris Hearn to call them immediately.
Moments later, police get a call back. But it's not the caller they were expecting.
The man identifies himself as Chris Hearn's attorney and says that he will get back to them after he's had a chance to talk to his client.
There's a host of reasons why somebody would preemptively lawyer up, as they say. It's due to a distrust of the police, or concerns that police may stumble into something else they're involved in. Of course, standard police thinking in many cases is that only guilty people do this.
In the homicide investigation of Royal Oak, Michigan hairdresser Renee Chupik, a man named Kevin Kaminsky claims that his acquaintance, Chris Hearn, killed Renee in self-defense.
Kevin said that Chris told him that he had grabbed the knife and stabbed Renee in order to protect himself.
But can investigators believe Kevin Kaminsky's story? For answers, police search for the transient, Chris Hearn. They also bring in the man who claims Chris killed Renee, Kevin Kaminsky.
Police asked Kevin Kaminsky about Chris and Chris's relationship with Renee. Kevin starts by saying that Chris was homeless and that he had allowed Chris to live at his apartment. Kevin knew of Chris's relationship with Renee from Chris, but Kevin had never met her. Chris told him that he had met Renee at an unknown bar when he was 17 and that the two had dated the last 7 years on and off.
Investigators asked Kevin to describe Chris's behavior.
Chris was typically outgoing and friendly, but on that particular day, Chris had stayed in his room and was quiet, which to Kevin was unusual. Kevin says he confronted Chris about his unusual behavior. Chris told him that he had gone to Renee's apartment expecting to have sex, but when he got there, found that all Renee wanted to do was argue with him about the past. And Chris was upset about it.
The age difference is certainly interesting because it could potentially tell investigators what led to the murder. Perhaps Chris felt that there was a power imbalance that he wanted to rectify. Perhaps there's an argument about that power differential and that goes wrong. And so enough is enough.
Detectives press Kevin more for what he knows about the night Chris went to Renee's apartment.
Kevin says, according to Chris, as he and Renee argued, she went into the kitchen and came after him with a wine bottle. And then came at him with a knife. After hearing this, Kevin said that he decided to record anything that Chris said on his phone in order to give it to the police as evidence.
Kaminsky pulls out the recording of the conversation he had with Chris.
Kevin tells police that he then asked about Renee's death.
Everything happened so fast that the girl came in an empty wine bottle and then comes at you with the knife. But she didn't hit you with it. That's the problem. You missed me, but she hit me with, but she got me with the knife. 3 stab wounds, 1 to you. Yeah.
Chris admitted stabbing Renee 3 times, once on the neck and twice in the torso.
I'm just trying to think all the CSI in my head. Where would they look for fingerprints at? Everywhere. I know, trust me, I looked at everywhere. I washed the sink handle, I washed the bottom of it, I washed the knife before I got rid of it.
Chris tells Kevin he doesn't know what he's going to do. Stay in town or run.
Running will put me as guilty, automatic. Fighting it will make it look like, alright, I am guilty, but I'm trying to show the real story of it. Of what really happened. You thought she could walk all over me and I was fed up with it, that's all. I mean, she treated it the wrong way, but she treated you like shit. Yeah, and someone does that to you all the time, you're gonna be like, okay, do it one more time.
Detectives still need to corroborate that. with forensic evidence or a confession from Chris himself. And to get either one, police need to find him first, if he's still in town. Kaminsky tells them to talk to Chris's friend Derek Brown, who may know more, and where Chris is now. Detectives track Derek down at a bar in town. He doesn't know where Chris is now, but he does know where Chris was on the night of the murder.
Derek tells police that on September 18th, he and Chris went to the Liberty Bar.
Derek told police that Chris received between 15 and 20 texts from Renee from 9:30 till about 11:30. Derek tells police that he dropped Chris off at Renee's apartment. Chris told Derek that he would spend the night there.
The next day, September 19th, Derek receives a call at approximately 7:30 a.m. asking him to pick up Chris at Renee's apartment. He had gotten into an argument with Renee and had to leave.
Derek's confirmation that Chris Hearn was at Renee Chupik's apartment the night she was murdered is the corroboration detectives need to charge Chris Hearn with murder. Police finally catch up with Chris on the street in Royal Oak and arrest him. Detectives can now piece together the events that led to the homicide of 41-year-old Renee Chupik.
September 18th at 9:30 p.m., Chris Hearn and Derek Brown arrive at Liberty Bar. At 11:50 p.m., Derek drives Chris to Renee's apartment.
At 12:25 a.m., Chris Hearn calls Renee. She picks up and lets him in. This is the last time Renee ever picks up her phone.
Renee and Chris talked and drank and then got into an argument about their past. She went into the kitchen and then came at him with a knife. Chris grabbed a hold of the knife. He struggled with Renee.
In the early hours, Chris stabs Renee once in the neck and twice in the torso.
Chris Hearn murders Renee Chupik.
24-year-old Chris Hearn is convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to serve between 48 and 90 years for the homicide of single.
Remember about Renee is that she loved unconditionally, and I'm sad I didn't get to spend more time with her.
The family is always a big driver for me. What does the family of the victim want to come out of this? And whether they think that's justice. Justice was done in this case.
There was a young white female laying across the bed sideways.
It's a brutal, brutal death.
Danielle Jennings is the most tragically innocent homicide case that I ever handled.
She was engaged to the love of her life.
They had some pretty spirited arguments from time to time.
He had violated that restraining order several times.
This is gateway behavior to something more sinister.
He decided to eliminate this young woman as a witness.
That's when the lights and bells went off.
We've got the right guy, but knowing and approving it are two different things.
Every day in North America, dozens of people are murdered. The key to solving the toughest of these homicides lies in the final 24 hours of the victim's life. To crack the case, detectives must reconstruct that critical timeline. The minutes and hours containing evidence that can help unlock the mystery and catch the killer. Just 20 miles northeast of Atlanta, Norcross, Georgia, is the largest town in sleepy Gwinnett County.
Back in the day, Norcross was a summer destination for people who lived in Atlanta trying to escape the heat. Nowadays, it's more of a commuter suburb for people who work in Atlanta.
It's picturesque, it's quaint, it's got lovely historical buildings, it's a great little town.
But on the Ides of March, near the turn of the millennium. This great little town becomes tragic for one family.
Just before 5 o'clock on March 15th,
911, what is your emergency?
Gwinnett County 911 dispatch receives an urgent telephone call. The caller, through his frantic pleading to the dispatcher, says, "Something's wrong with my wife. I tried to wake her up. I turned her over, but she's dead. Somebody has strangled her to death."
Police units race to 1 Ashley Lakes Drive.
Getting an urgent call about an apparent homicide from this apartment complex is a little surprising. It's not the kind of place that has a reputation for that kind of violence.
Upon arriving at the scene, they met the victim's fiancé, Lenny. Her fiancé also lived in the apartment with her. Laying across the bed sideways, there was a young white female, and she had a ligature tied around her neck, extremely tight.
The bedclothes underneath where she is lying to her death. Our deceased is identified as 20-year-old Danielle Jennings, the single mother of a 2-year-old son.
Gwinnett County Police immediately called for the homicide unit to respond to investigate.
Veteran homicide detective Dave Henry is assigned to the case.
Danielle Jennings does not appear to have been sexually assaulted. And you look at her closer, and she has a pantyhose or nylon stocking so tight around her neck that you couldn't get a finger underneath the ligature and the skin of her neck. I could see no apparent defensive wounds on her hands or wrist. There didn't appear to be any marks or abrasions on her face or up around her neck area other than the ligature.
There's no indication that she snatched at or clawed at her attacker. She had no chance to employ her hands or to attack her attacker.
That means that the perpetrator was on her back, physically holding her down as he strangled her with the pantyhose.
Our victim has emitted some blood which is sampled and saved to see what may be proven by it. Besides the victim's own intact hair, there is also some loose hair which is collected for the same reason.
I looked around the room to see if any type of burglary or possibly theft had occurred. The top drawer of her dresser was open, which was the drawer that had her socks and undergarments in it.
It looks like somebody has attempted to ransack it. And of note, neither in that drawer or anywhere in the bedroom was a stocking matching or similar to the one that had been used to strangle her.
Investigators also find signs of a struggle in the living and dining room.
A purse had been dumped out onto the floor as if somebody had gone through the purse looking for money or jewelry. The sofa was out of place, maybe a foot or two. That could have happened when he took control of her. Looked at the door jamb to see if there were any type of tool marks or foot marks or any damage to the door jamb. There was no apparent damages to that.
We are assuming that her attacker either had access to let himself in or he was let in.
Based on the evidence, investigators form a theory of what may have happened.
Her attacker came in the front door and was already in the midst of burglarizing it.
Danielle, living room.
Based on the apparent suddenness of the attack and the victim's belongings being scattered in the apartment, this burglar interrupted in the act who decided to eliminate this young woman as a witness.
The killer dragged Danielle into the bedroom and strangled her from behind with a knee-high stocking. To picture Danielle's last moments, clawing at her neck, fighting to stay alive, it's a brutal, brutal death.
Danielle Jennings is the most tragically innocent homicide victim whose case I ever handled. She had her whole life in front of her. She was young and a single mother, and she just wandered accidentally through no fault of her own, into the end of her life.
To find Danielle Jennings' killer, detectives will need to reconstruct the last 24 hours of her life. They start with her fiancé, Lenny, to find out what he might know.
The last time Lenny and Danielle spoke would have been late the morning she was killed, around 11. He called her to work, and on the phone, Lenny learned that Danielle planned to go home for lunch at about 11:30. Lenny's 911 call to us occurred at about 4:45 p.m.
Well, we can develop the timeline between the last time that she was seen alive to when she was found deceased. So we had a time frame of 11:30 a.m. to 4:45 p.m.
Our first step in confirming that tentative timeline is to call Danielle's place of business. Their supervisor confirms that she did in fact leave the office at 11:30 and never returned.
Since Lenny is the last person to speak to Danielle and the first to report her murder, investigators take a closer look at the fiancé.
Lenny is going to be a person of interest.
1 in 5 murders is perpetrated by somebody's intimate or domestic partner. The majority of the perpetrators tend to be male and the victim's female. So Lenny, statistically, is a suspect.
Investigators ask Lenny for more background on his relationship with Danielle.
Lenny is understandably very upset. He tells us that he's known Danielle since childhood and has always been fond of her. Now, he was going to be her partner and a father to her son.
But when detectives talk to others that were close to Danielle, police learn that Lenny has a dark side.
Police speak that Lenny has a very fiery temper.
Danielle was a very attractive woman, and Lenny was a jealous person. They had some pretty spirited arguments from time to time.
When it's learned that there's some hot and cold, kind of feisty arguments as part of this couple's relationship, the question is, how much aggression does Lenny have, and could this aggression be directed towards the victim in this case?
So now police have to take a hard look at Lenny. He has access to the apartment, and he is the one who discovered her body. And it is not unusual for a killer to call 911 and report a body to try to throw police off their trail.
Less than 24 hours after the murder of 20-year-old mother Danielle Jennings, her best friend tells police that Danielle had a history of conflict with her fiancé, Lenny.
With all the screaming and yelling that went on at the apartment, could Lenny have killed Danielle and then called 911 to cover his tracks?
Police in Gwinnett County, Georgia, want to hear how Lenny answers that question in person.
We wanted to find out more about his relationship with Danielle.
Lenny admits to detectives that he and Danielle had heated arguments.
Life was not all smooth sailing for Lenny and Danielle. Their credit card was almost maxed out, and they had financial problems and money problems in a relationship, especially where there's a little one involved, can lead to arguments that escalate out of control and turn violent.
We come straight out asking Lenny, did you have anything to do with the death of Danielle? And he replied no.
Lenny said he loved Danielle, and there is no way he would have ever harmed Danielle.
We ran a criminal history on Lenny. He had absolutely no criminal history. He's never had any domestic quarrels where the police had to be called to his home, but that doesn't mean that he's not capable of doing something like this. So we have to get his timeline, and then we'll go back and corroborate that statement.
Lenny tells the police that on the morning of the murder, March 15th, he and Danielle leave the house at about 6:45 a.m. Danielle dropped her son Tom off at daycare at about 7:30.
He said that around 11 o'clock or so, Danielle had called him. She wanted to go to lunch with him. And later on, he got a call from Danielle's supervisor because Danielle had not returned to work from lunch.
Lenny got concerned and tried repeatedly to call her at home, but without success. He left many messages on their home answering machine.
So then he left work and drove home and got there at about 4:45. The front door was unlocked, which was uncommon. He went inside and found her laying on the bed, and then he called 911.
Now detectives need to confirm Lenny's times and whereabouts.
Lenny says he was at work from 11:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., and his colleagues can confirm it.
And also, we located a answering machine for the home. And there were several calls from Lenny until the time that he arrived at around 4:45. And so with that time frame that he's accounted for, he was eliminated as a suspect.
No longer a suspect, Lenny becomes an ally.
The stocking that was used to kill Danielle, no mate is apparent within the apartment. Lenny says that no stocking was in the apartment at all. Danielle did not wear them. This tells us that this burglar came prepared and had a potential murder weapon with him if he needed it.
So police ask Lenny who he might know that would want to hurt Danielle.
Lenny says that Danielle had recently filed a sexual harassment complaint against a coworker named Jordan. Jordan had been hanging around Danielle's desk and made inappropriate comments that made Danielle uncomfortable.
At one point, he even showed her a couple of DVDs that had salacious or suggestive content.
They had explicit sex scenes in them. Jordan told her that one of the people in the video reminded him of her.
So Danielle complained about him to both her supervisor and the manager.
Almost immediately, management meets with Jordan and cautions him to remain professional. Jordan reacts badly, seeming to be insulted by the reprimand.
And so they scheduled another meeting between upper management and Danielle and Jordan about her complaint. That meeting would take place somewhere around 4 o'clock in the afternoon that day that she was killed.
As soon as you factor in what's known as a courtship disorder, somebody with a very distorted and more sinister, and naturally, police would have to look long and hard at this guy.
Knowing they had a meeting set, Jordan may have left shortly after Danielle did and followed her home, knocks on the door, enters the house, so that he can discuss in private what's going to happen at this meeting. And he ended up getting angry and snapped and killed Danielle. I wanted to locate Jordan immediately and question him.
When police track Jordan down, he's evasive. He's nervous. It looks like he's hiding something.
He admitted that he had done everything that Danielle had accused him of doing. He agreed that he had given her the DVDs and made statements to her, but he had not seen anything wrong with what he had done.
Investigators asked Jordan for his whereabouts after Danielle left the office.
Jordan gave the alibi that between 11 o'clock and 4 p.m., he was with a coworker in that coworker's truck the entire time until they got back to the office.
Now the question for investigators is, can Jordan prove he's not lying?
Jordan's coworker alibied him, so that eliminated Jordan as a person of interest.
Having eliminated both Lenny and Jordan, our next step was to get together with anyone and everyone closest to Danielle to try to develop other leads. People she had been with, anybody that we could pursue as a suspect.
A good friend of Danielle's brought up an old boyfriend that Danielle had by the name of Chuck.
Chuck McFadden is a 28-year-old tow truck driver who Danielle had dated for 2 years.
She said that he seemed like he was a really nice guy when she first met him, but then once they got to dating after a little bit, he wanted to know where she was at every minute of the day and who she was with. He became very jealous of her, very controlling.
Danielle tired of his behavior and broke it off. But that only made matters worse.
Chuck was furious when Danielle left him. He had threatened to kill her. This forced her to get a restraining order against him, and that only angered him more.
He had violated that restraining order several times by driving up and down the street that she lived on. He would call her home. He would leave messages on her answering machine. Those were things that he was not supposed to be doing according to the restraining order.
Chuck had a robbery, and the scene did really indicate that Danielle interrupted a burglary gone wrong.
Detectives now believe Danielle's ex made good on his threat to end her life. The day after 20-year-old mother Danielle Jennings is found strangled to death in her Georgia apartment, Gwinnett County detectives discover that she was being stalked by her ex-boyfriend, tow truck driver Chuck McFadden.
Chuck did not take seriously the force of the restraining order and actually increased his attempts to contact Danielle. Chuck would not take no for an answer and became an unwelcome presence in her life, following her around and threatening to harm her.
Chuck is on the radar because he has many risk factors that are associated with an intimate partner homicide, even if that relationship has ended. He's jealous, he's engaging in stalking behavior, which shows a level of controlling fixation. This idea of sexual proprietariness, this is a known risk factor for escalation and violence.
When police contact Chuck McFadden, he seems eager to talk about Danielle.
Chuck stated that when he met Danielle, she was kind of down and out on her luck.
Danielle was pregnant, although Chuck was not the father of the child.
But he helped her get back on her feet, helped her get a job so that she could start taking care of her son.
Chuck recalls a mostly positive 2-year relationship, but according to Chuck, he and Danielle broke up a few months after her son was born.
Chuck says he has not spoken to Danielle since, but just talking about Danielle gets him angrier and angrier.
At this point, Chuck's belligerent and hostile.
That sets off an alarm. Chuck did have a bad feeling towards Danielle because she was not with him anymore and she was with somebody else.
We had to consider the possibility that he'd become aware of Lenny being her new man and deciding that if he couldn't have her, no one would.
As Chuck gets more heated, detectives only encourage it.
One strategy to counteract anger is to show that you're validating a person's emotions. Investigators may want to hear about his anger, why he's escalating, what's driving that, because it may help them so they can get the information that they need. What are the reasons for him to be angry, and are they related potentially to this homicide?
The strategy works. Chuck opens up about Danielle even more.
He felt that after she got back on her feet, that she used him for that. She was not treating him the way that he felt that she should have been. After speaking with him to try and get him to calm down a little bit and talk more, I move over into his alibi of where he may have been. As a tow truck driver, he does a lot of business outside the state for the company that he works for. Chuck gave me an alibi that he was out of state on the day that she was killed, and that the company had receipts for the entire trip.
Detectives reach out to Chuck's employer to confirm his story.
Chuck's boss verified his alibi over the phone, and then also sent us copies of his receipts, which showed that he was out of town in another state at the time that Danielle was killed. And so we were able to eliminate Chuck as a person of interest.
So at this point, the case is at a standstill as far as viable suspects are concerned.
Undaunted, investigators take a different tack.
Instead of looking at specific people, we decide to look at the apartment complex itself and the context of what had happened to see if that would help.
As officers canvass the buildings, word spreads the police are looking for new leads.
Unexpectedly, we receive a phone call from another resident in Danielle's apartment complex.
She was home one morning and had a knock on the door, and when she went to the door, there was nobody there. She was walking back to the bedroom, and then all of a sudden her front door opened, and a man walked into the apartment. She was kind of taken back by it, and he identified himself as one of the maintenance workers there to work on a work order that she had called in. While he was doing the repair work, he would continually look over at her. She said that made her feel really uncomfortable the way that he was looking at her. Later on that day, I received another phone call from another lady in the complex with just about the same story as the first lady had, with the exception that the lady said, "I never called in a work order." He just walked in and says, "I'm here to fix your lights."
The women's statements set police in motion.
We returned to the complex to see if any other residents had had those same kinds of disturbing experiences. And it turned out that's exactly what had been happening at the complex over the previous several months.
We discovered there had been several burglaries from apartments where there had been no forced entry, and one individual, her checkbook was missing, and some of her checks had been cashed.
Just one man committed all those break-ins, then targeted Danielle's place, and suddenly the crime escalated to murder.
We ran criminal histories on all the maintenance people on the complex, and we came up with one person that had a criminal history. We obtained a picture of that guy. We went back to the first two ladies that had called in, and we showed them the photo lineup, and both of them identified the same person in the photo lineup.
The women confirm the maintenance man who entered their homes is 42-year-old Calvin Oliver.
He's been convicted of burglary. He's been convicted of robbery. He's been convicted of rape.
He also has an outstanding warrant for failing to appear in court.
The lights just get brighter and brighter on Calvin Oliver.
So Calvin, somehow, despite his background, ends up as a maintenance man at this apartment complex. He's put into a position of significant trust. This is somebody with a history of sex assault and burglary, where he's given keys to all the units. And then he begins making unannounced entry into consistently the apartments of young women, often under the pretext of he's there to fix something. This, to investigators, has to be a multiplicity of red flags.
They, of course, run Calvin Oliver's fingerprints against what they found in Danielle's apartment, but there's not a match. They don't find anything.
And Calvin also has no prior record of homicide. So is it really possible this former petty thief is responsible for the murder of single mother Danielle Jennings? Four days after the murder of 20-year-old mother Danielle Jennings, Gwinnett County, Georgia police discover that a maintenance man at Danielle's apartment complex, Calvin Oliver, had prior convictions for burglary and rape.
We talked to the maintenance supervisor, who advised us that there was a master key that would fit any and every residential apartment on the premises. The supervisor noticed one day that it was off its hook. When he noticed this missing master key, the only other worker on duty had been Calvin Oliver.
So ex-con Calvin Oliver could have accessed Danielle's apartment.
It seems logical that Calvin is our prime suspect. He may have been surprised by her while burglarizing her apartment and killed her.
But detectives found no fingerprints or other forensic evidence of Calvin's inside Danielle's apartment.
The fact is, we need some concrete physical evidence that will link him to some wrongdoing in Danielle's death.
Warrant for missing a prior court date.
There's a copy of that warrant. Take a look at that.
We are hoping to gain any information we can about any of the break-ins, but of course, without telling him this, what we really want to know is how he might be connected to Danielle's death.
We asked him if he had seen anybody suspicious or if he had any knowledge of any of the burglaries
Yeah, we got some incident reports where people will file police reports on items taken down there at the complex down at Ashley Lanes. Have you heard about any of those?
No, I haven't heard about nothing being taken. I don't remember none of it. I can't say that I remember any of this stuff that was taken.
He denied having any knowledge of any burglaries going on. He had not heard about any.
Detectives asked Calvin about his record.
I used to go in and treat people's houses and stuff, right?
Yeah, when I was young.
Right.
When I was young.
And you actually went to jail several times for that.
I went to jail 4 times. I went to jail 4 times. One time I shouldn't even went.
You just only ever went to jail 4 times?
Yeah.
It's your past, right? It's your past.
It's my past, but I'm gonna run this somebody over here. I ain't into that no more. Just say we sitting there talking. Shit, I wasn't into it, but that was street stuff. That when I had street life, you know, it took my wife, you know, to put in my head more to life than that.
He basically said, I've learned my lesson. Why would somebody that knows I know be stupid enough to do something like this?
The whole time that we were interviewing him, he was very calm, very collected.
Mr. Oliver does not say anything particularly incriminating. He is not some scared teenager that's going to collapse in tears when the police talk to him. He's just biding his time, waiting for us to give up.
But what he says next catches the detective's attention.
You know, y'all ain't said nothing about that girl yet. But if I could do anything in this world, if I can remember anything that might be up here, I don't, you know.
Well, you know, is there anything that you can tell us?
Believe me, I would do so.
Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Ain't nothing I can tell you, because, like I said, I don't know that girl, you know, and that couple of times I seen her, you know, the nice couple, you know, like that to happen to that girl. She was nice, and, you know, they got a nice little baby.
It's interesting that he initiates mention of Danielle.
And you brought it up. Somebody always.
Somebody's always. That's right.
I didn't know that anything happened to Doc came and woke me up. But,
over there in the property working money, right?
Yeah, I was there. I'm saying that I was asleep.
Oh, you mean while you're supposed to be working, you were sleeping?
Yeah.
On Monday?
Yeah.
Did they furnish you an apartment over there?
Yeah. They give me a 20% discount.
He stated that he didn't have any information pertaining to the murder.
He was confident he was elsewhere, but not elsewhere that could be corroborated by anyone else. He has an outstanding warrant for failure to appear in court, although that's a fairly minor offense. It does give us a useful tool to keep him in custody long enough for us to take the next investigative step.
While Calvin Oliver sits in a holding cell, police execute a warrant to search his apartment at the complex.
We're searching for property that we know that has been taken in a previous burglary in the complex, or looking for something in the apartment that would link him physically to Danielle Jennings.
One practical hope we have in looking in Mr. Oliver's apartment is the possibility that we might discover a mate to the stocking that was used to strangle Danielle. Unfortunately, we didn't find the stocking.
But detectives do spot something else that catches their eye.
I noticed a diamond ring that was sitting on the dresser. We didn't have any jewelry specified in the search warrant. Nobody remembered any jewelry being taken. And so we photographed it and left it in place.
They don't find any evidence tying Calvin Oliver to the murder of Danielle, but they do find some checks that most definitely are not his property.
The checks are soon confirmed to be a match with those reported stolen from an apartment resident.
When detectives return to police headquarters, they're eager to show Calvin Oliver what they've found in his apartment.
We confront Mr. Oliver about it, and he basically says, okay, you got me on the checks, but I'm not a murderer.
All this helps with the case against Oliver for the burglaries, but none of this helps with the murder of Danielle.
Detectives charge Calvin Oliver with burglary. But 24 hours later, he makes bail and is released.
The police are beginning to think that this is yet another dead end. Again, do we have the wrong guy? They just don't know. It's been almost a week since Danielle's murder, and they are nowhere.
A week after Gwinnett County, Georgia, fiancé.
Lenny, the fiance, he asked if he could get Danielle's engagement ring back. I said, well, you never told us about a ring that was missing. He said, well, I thought the medical examiner would have had it because she always wears it. And I collected some jewelry from them that she had, but there was no engagement ring there. So I had him describe the engagement ring, and that's when the lights and bells went off, because I remember seeing a ring similar to that description on the dresser in Calvin Oliver's apartment.
Detectives ask Lenny to come down to examine the ring in person, to see if it's the same one that he bought for Danielle that was on her finger when she was killed.
Lenny positively identified the ring. He said that Danielle had been wearing that ring when she left to go to work that morning. The people at her work saw the engagement ring on her finger on the day that she was murdered. Now I have a piece of physical evidence that connects Calvin Oliver to Danielle Jennings.
Investigators haul Calvin back into the interrogation room to see if he's willing to admit to what police suspect.
I've been in trouble too many times not to know the seriousness of this case. It was a murder investigation. It's a murder investigation. I don't know.
He's adamant that he knows nothing about it.
There's no reason. Ain't no reason. Like, for me. I mean, ain't no... What them people got that I want? What did this woman? This woman ain't never did nothing to me. Ain't never... I don't know I can explain it to you.
He challenges us as to what evidence we might have against him.
What evidence you have on me? I think that's what I want to take somebody else's life.
I said, well, we found this ring in your room, and that's Danielle's ring. And he said, well, I stole that when I was in there doing a work order 2 weeks ago.
The police have evidence to refute this. Lenny saw the ring on her finger the day of the murder.
We feel strongly we've got the right guy, but knowing and improving it are two different things. We need something that will, in a concrete, admissible court way, connect Calvin Oliver to this homicide.
Detectives believe the murderer brought the stocking with him to kill Danielle, since Danielle never wore them.
Police try one more thing. They tell him that they're going to charge him with malice murder. That's because the police think that he took the stocking with him into the apartment, which means he had intent to harm someone. This gets Calvin talking.
I'm just talking off the bat. I went through so much hell these past few days, and for this to happen to me.
And then, out of the blue, we get that break.
No, I mean, school, because...
Calvin Oliver says there was no intent there.
When he said there was no intent, that is Mr. Oliver placing himself in the apartment with Danielle when she was murdered. That means that Calvin Oliver murdered Danielle Jennings.
Detectives can now piece together what happened to Danielle Jennings.
At 11 a.m., Danielle speaks to Lenny and asks him to come home and meet her for lunch. Lenny's sorry, but he can't get away from work.
At 11:30 a.m., Danielle leaves the office to go home for lunch. Sometime before 12 o'clock noon, Calvin Oliver uses his key to get into Danielle's apartment and begins the process of burglarizing it.
At 12 noon, Danielle enters the apartment.
Desperate to not get caught, Oliver attacks Danielle.
He takes control of her, throws her on the bed. He strangles her with the stocking around her neck.
He finishes the process of fatally tightening the stocking around her neck and tying it off in a knot at the back of her neck. After he kills her, he yanks the engagement ring from her finger.
Calvin Oliver is sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Danielle Jennings, and to an additional 10 years for the theft of her engagement ring.
Danielle Jennings was a tragic victim. She was young, beautiful, had a child, had a fiancé, had a new job. Her life was finally clicking, and then Calvin Oliver snuffed it out.
Calvin Oliver stole a living mother. He stole a living fiancé. He stole a daughter. Nothing can replace Danielle.
It feels very good to be able to give family some type of closure on this case. I mean, they don't have their loved one there anymore, but at least they know the person that's responsible is not going to be out taking anyone else's life. And it feels really good.